This is part 2 of the online lecture to accompany chapter 14 in your textbook. I highly recommend you read chapter 14 as there are lots of examples, ideas, theories, and concepts that I simply don't have time to address in this lecture. You can stop, pause, and replay this lecture as often as you like. Alright, let's talk a little bit about graphs and charts. One of the most effective kinds of supporting material or evidence that you can use in your speeches is, of course, statistics, the use of numbers, especially when you're trying to show how big of a problem something is or how something has changed over time. But there is nothing more boring than listening to somebody recite a list of numbers. So a great kind of visual aid that you might be able to use in your speech is, of course, a graph or a chart. Now, there are a couple of different types of graphs, and these graphs are used particularly to show patterns of numbers and show how things change over time. So there are 3 different types of graphs that you might be able to use. Now, there are plenty more than 3 types of graphs out there, but for purposes of what we do in a speech and the kinds of evidence or supporting material that we show, these 3 types are the most commonly used. So these are the ones we're going to talk about. A line graph. A line graph is where you use lines to show how things change over time. A pie graph is usually a circle, and it shows how things are divided up. It shows how, if you take a whole number, how that thing is divided up into percentages. And then there is a bar graph, and bar graphs are where you compare things. You put them up against each other so you can see how they compare. So let's take a look at each one of these things. The first type of graph that we're going to talk about is a line graph. Now, this is a great example of a line graph. As you can see, there are lines that show how things change over time. The blue line has to do with how much of your personal spending is spent on health care. And as you can see, at the bottom it shows decades from 1980 to 2010. And along the side, it shows percentage of personal spending. So that's the health care. And as you can see, in 1980, you spent about 12% of personal spending on health care, but that has risen as time has passed until in 2010 we were spending about 20% of our income on health care. Now the other line, the red line, shows how much we spend on food. And in 1980 we were spending about 20% of our personal income on food, and that has actually decreased over time till we're spending about 12% of our personal income on food in 2010. So the interesting thing about that, and probably why this person is using it, is they're showing is that there has been like a complete reversal of the percentage of money spent on healthcare and food over that 30-year period. And you could say that, but helping the audience to understand it by giving them a visual representation of it is much more effective than just saying it. That's a good example of using a line graph in a speech. Then we have what's called a pie graph, and as I said, this is how things break down from the whole into percentages. This visual aid is used to show how things have changed over more than a century. The first pie graph, the one that's labeled 1900, shows that in 1900, 68% of women in the workforce were single, and then 18% were widowed or divorced, and 14% were married. Compare that to what has happened in 2010, 52% of the women in the workforce are married, so that's like a complete turnaround as well. But because you're showing the percentage of the whole, this is a much better visual representation of what you're trying to get across to your audience. So you may want to consider a pie graph if you're talking about percentages of a whole. Then the final type that we use in our speeches is called a bar graph. And as you can see, the numbers, the statistics are represented by these bars. And a bar graph is used if you want to compare things. And as you can see, there are different things that are being compared here. What this person is doing is comparing African Americans to Caucasians on these 4 measures: median household income, infant mortality, unemployment, and college degrees. So what they do is they put them up against each other so you can look at it and instantaneously get a picture of how these 2 different groups compare. If you are trying to compare 2 or more things, you may want to use a bar graph. Charts are summarizations of large blocks of information, and usually this would be text. If it was just numbers, you would probably want to use a graph, but in this case, this person decided that even though they're using percentages, they thought it might be easier for the audience to understand if they just listed these things from greatest percent of U.S. immigrants to least percent. This is another way to help the audience visualize the information. Another way in which you could use a chart is if you're trying to show the steps of a process. You could list step 1, step 2, step 3 in a chart, and that would help the audience to follow along with you when you're explaining how something works. Just remember that graphs are used to help the audience visualize statistics, and charts are used to summarize large blocks of information. This is the end of part 2 of chapter 14. Please close this window and open part 3.